Better.
All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of Conspiracy or Just a Coincidence. So today I am super lucky, and everyone listening is super lucky. I was telling them I have two published authors, and we're going to have an awesome time. So it is the Great Giant Debate, pun intended. So I have Gary Wayne and Ken Ammi. So Gary, I guess just introduce yourself, and then we'll introduce Ken.
Sure. For people who may not be aware of me, and I'm sure there are many, my name is Gary Wayne. I'm the author of The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind. And if you want to get a hold of me to ask me a question or maybe ask for some documents on them, some things that I do at no charge, that's at www.genesis6conspiracy.com with the number 6conspiracy.com. I classify myself as a Christian contrarian and a researcher. So I'm a researcher first. And my definition of a Christian contrarian is I like to verify everything that I can. And I just don't necessarily take the word of somebody that says something or said they read something or said they saw something. I need to be able to sort of verify it.
I love it. Great. Ken?
Yeah, Ken Ammi. I consider myself an independent researcher. Nephilim and giants have been an issue of fascination for me. I've published, well, it depends how you count them, maybe 7 or 9 books on these topics. And it's kind of no surprise I ended up researching the kind of issues I do in the Bible because the paranormal has been a fascination of mine since at least I was in the 6th grade. So it's kind of not surprising that I'm a Messianic Jew, by the way. So when I really got serious into Bible study, it's kind of no surprise that's where I ended up, is doing what I like to term systematic biblical paranormology. So that's part of what we're doing here tonight.
Awesome. No, yes. And again, this is so awesome. Like two guys that have spent countless hours researching and reading. So I'm really excited for this. So I guess, Ken, why don't you introduce your stance, and then we'll have Gary do his. So your belief.
As in a succinct statement, or are we doing starting the official?
Yeah, we'll start the official opening. Yeah.
Okay. And the amount of time?
Yeah, you can go as long as, 10, 15 minutes, whatever you feel comfortable with. Yeah.
Yes. Excellent. So now, one of the fascinating things about the Nephilology, is what I'll term it, is that we're told precious little about it in the Bible, and yet that has led to millennia's worth of discussion, of interpretation, of debate, and to the point where in our modern day, Nephilim have become the stuff of video games and movies. And get yourself on a website that sells books and look up Nephilim romance. I mean, there's an entire cottage industry about novels about romance, Nephilim related. I mean, it's really kind of amazing how the precious little we're told has turned into what it has. So, strictly speaking, the Bible speaks to us in about in not even 2 texts. You can't even go that far. It's 2 verses, period. And so my approach is to look at it logically, theologically, and textually, and also commonsensically. I find that I tend to like to start at the very common sense level, and then I will up the level of complexity whenever I discern that it needs be done. Okay, so now the 3 main approaches I find people take is to say that, well, we don't have enough data biblically to really build a doctrine of Nephilology, so let's just kind of leave it alone. And that kind of makes it nice and easy to ignore. And that's part of why it's considered not a primary issue whatsoever, right? So then there's another approach that says, well, yeah, we have precious little data, but we'll go ahead and build all-encompassing worldview philosophies and hermeneutics by filling the gaps really with anything that appears to be relevant from anywhere, anytime, anybody, regardless of historical, cultural, or grammatical context. And then my approach would be to handle the precious little that we have very carefully, right? My precious. And so now the biblical story of Nephilim is very succinct, and yet it is a full beginning, middle, and end story. We do get that. And it comes to a full and utter end. So let's start by review that. And I'm going to just read the first verse. In Genesis 6, we're told about sons of God who come into the daughters of men, and they produce these offspring that are called Nephilim. And what we're told about them specifically is that they were mighty men of old, men of renown, even if we're not told why or how. Why were they well known, right, of renown? What they did do that was mighty. We're not specifically told, but that's what we know. And this is the pre-flood timeline. So essentially, we know their parentage, and I know the issue of who the sons of God are is a huge issue. We know who their parents were. We know they lived pre-flood. We very roughly know when they were first born. We know they were mighty and well known, and that's about it for the first reference. But what's important is to keep in mind that since this is a pre-flood reference, then the 5 or so times that the Bible absolutely affirms that only Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives and some animals survived the flood. So since that's repeated to us over and over again, we know that Nephilim didn't survive the flood, period. Full stop. Okay. Now, there is a post-flood reference to Nephilim. So the question becomes, well, then how could that be? Well, we already know they didn't survive, so maybe they returned. The issue is that there's absolutely no such statement of any such thing anywhere in the whole Bible, period, whatsoever. It just doesn't exist. So that has forced people to literally just invent scenarios whereby we could have post-flood Nephilim, even though they didn't survive. So the first assertion is that they returned, and that's followed by other assertions that are just stories about how that might have happened. So that's all unbiblical. And I draw a distinction between something that's unbiblical and something that's anti-biblical, right? Those are two different things. I happen to think this is both. It's unbiblical, it's not in the Bible, and it's anti-biblical, specifically if you were to take the view that the flood was at least in part God getting rid of Nephilim, but then you tell us there's post-flood Nephilim, you're implying that God failed or that they found some kind of loophole that God missed or some such thing. But anyhow, let's focus on the second verse about Nephilim, because that is really the mother of all Nephilim verses, right? All 2 of them. And it's very important to interact with the narrative in which that verse appears, because it's way too common for people to just pick up one single verse out of Numbers chapter 13. They'll pick it up, they'll run with it, and they'll build an entire all-encompassing theory out of it. But we need to really, really understand what it's telling us. So this is the narrative of when spies are sent into the land of Canaan. They reconnoiter it, and they return. First thing they talk about is, hey, look at the fruit, right? Here's the fruit of the land. Then they say it's a good land that flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Then they say, however, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large, and besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of Negeb. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites dwell in the hill country. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. Okay, that is the original report that's presented, and it's accepted as is. No question. Now, the next verse says, but Caleb quieted the people before Moses. So let's pause there a second. That lets you know that the reaction, even though it was accepted as is, it was accepted with some trepidation. I mean, there's something happening that Caleb feels he needs to quiet them, right? Calm them down. And he says, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are able to overcome it. Okay, so what was going on there? If we look at the original report, I think the only real thing that would alarm them is that they're told about that the people are strong, and get this, cities are fortified and very large. Now, the cultural context is that at this point, the Israelites are itinerant and they're tent dwellers. Now, these people dwelling in tents are being told, you know what, you're going to have to confront multiple people groups who are all strong and who live in large fortified cities. So you could kind of see how that'd be at least intimidating right there. So that helps us to understand the reaction. But Caleb, he basically, Caleb says, get her done, right? And now the next verse says, then the men who had gone up with him said, let me pause a second. So we end up finding that Joshua sides with Caleb. And then so you have 10 spies on one side and 2 on the other. So the 10 say, we are not able to against the people, for they are stronger than we. So they brought up, this is the very next verse. After that discouraging statement, now we're told they brought up a bad report, sometimes rendered evil report of the land. They spied out, saying the land through which we had gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and the people we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak who come from the Nephilim. And we seem to them we seem to ourselves as grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. By the way, this rendering, the sons of Anak who come from the Nephilim, translations will vary slightly. I'm not going to nitpick it. So we have an original report, we have encouragement, we have discouragement, and then we have a bad report. So that's the layout of the relevant portions of this statement. So now, since the 10 begin by discouraging the Israelites from doing that which God had commanded them, we instantly know they're at the very least unfaithful and disloyal. That should be of great concern right then and there. Okay. Moreover, you'll notice that the original report stated that the people were strong. The people in the land are strong. That's the description. And even in their original discouragement, they affirm that they are stronger than we. Okay. Now, in the bad report, they decide to embellish that. All of a sudden, they're claiming that all of those people are of great height. Okay, now that's obviously a subjective term, but that's what they claim. So that's at the very least an embellishment, not only on the original report, but on their discouraging statements. Now you'll notice too that whereas the original report had the land that's flowing with milk and honey, the bad report has it that it's a land that devours its inhabitants. And so that's a straight up contradiction of the original report. So now we know they're unfaithful, we know they're disloyal, we know they're embellishers, we know they're contradictory. And that's just getting started, by the way. Then they claim that they saw the Nephilim. Well, now that's another embellishment because the original report was extremely specific. They saw the Anakim, Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, and Canaanites. No mention of Nephilim, but they embellished that. Oh, guess what? We also saw them. And yet what's interesting is that there's a missing data point there because earlier in the chapter, it was specified where the Anakim lived. And here it's specified where the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, and Canaanites lived. But these guys seem to be unable to pinpoint where the Nephilim was. It's just a generic statement. We saw them. Forget where, they just we saw them. Okay. And then there's the statement that correlates Anakim with Nephilim, that Anakim somehow come from Nephilim. Now, one of the issues we have is that outside of Numbers 13:33, there's absolutely no post-flood Nephilim reference in the entire Bible, period, full stop. And we're also not told that anybody post-flood is related to them. So when we're told the Anakim are related to them, that calls into question this claim, because this is the one and only place you could ever even imagine anything like that. And then the reference to Nephilim being very, very, very tall. is another thing that's unknown, because we just read the only other verse about Nephilim. It did not provide us a physical description of Nephilim. So we have unfaithful, disloyal, contradictory, embellishing guys who, by the way, contradict Moses, Caleb, Joshua, God, and the rest of the whole entire Bible, because all of them, for example, refer to Anakim in the land, but none of them say a single word about post-flood Nephilim ever, not one single time whatsoever, nor of anybody who's ever related to them whatsoever. So I'm going to side with Moses, Caleb, Joshua, God, and the rest of the Bible. I'm not going to side with some of the most unreliable guys in the whole Bible, whom, by the way, God ends up rebuking with extreme prejudice because of this occurrence. And so we see that this bad report and every single point of it is problematic. Now, consider that Moses relates this event in Deuteronomy 1, and he says, our brothers have made our hearts melt. And then he quotes them. The people are greater and taller than we. The cities are great and fortified up to heaven. Besides, we have seen the sons of the Anakim there. Moses utterly ignores their claim about Nephilim. It's absolutely irrelevant because Moses knows the facts and he's more concerned about the real danger on the ground, particularly Anakim, who were notorious. Who could stand before the Anakim was a saying in those days, right? So now then, if we look at the Septuagint version of Numbers 13:33, and there we saw the giants, and we were before them as locusts. Yea, even so were we before them. So what's interesting is in the Septuagint, there's no reference to Anakim whatsoever. And that's part of why, incidentally, a lot of scholars think that the reference to Anakim there is just a gloss. It wasn't in the original text. But I don't even think that's really worth discussing right now. The point is, Moses relating of that event absolutely ignores Nephilim. They're irrelevant. The LXS ignores the Anakim. They're not related to Nephilim. Okay. So then what ends up happening here is you are either going to claim post-flood Nephilim and that Anakim are related to them and that they're very, very, very tall, exclusively based on one single verse stated by unfaithful, disloyal, contradictory embellishers whom God rebuked, or you're going to read the Bible the way it's laid out. Nephilim lived pre-flood. They came to a full end at the flood. There's no such thing as post-flood Nephilim ever in any way, shape, or form. And this was just a don't go in the woods type of fear-mongering, scare tactic tall tale, right? So maybe they reached back into their cultural memory and literally invented some Nephilim mythology on the spot, or maybe some Nephilim mythology already existed and they just played off of it. Regardless, there are many, many ways to know and understand that this is just made up stuff by these guys whom God rebuked. And so any reliable Bible view on this issue would recognize that there not only was there and no post-flood Nephilim, there never will be either, for various reasons, including that if you think that the flood had to do with Nephilim, then any concept of a return of them or survival would be problematic. So that's why this one verse and text is so incredibly important, because it shows us that they just made up a tall tale, and this haunts us till this day. And that's my time. Thank you.
No, that was great. And I'm sure Gary, once you're done with your intro, then we can probably do the questions, because I'm sure you got a lot of things. So I think it would be best you do your point, if that's all right, you do your point of view, and then we do questions. Awesome. Great.
Absolutely. So how I approach the Bible is really quite simple. It is literal, and everything that's sort of allegorical in the Bible, I'm going to define within the Bible. I tend not to leave out inconvenient passages so that you can look at the whole story, because I don't believe the Bible is in contradiction. Where people say they're contradictions, they haven't researched enough and found why that's not a contradiction. And so I find with that sort of approach, by not trying to ignore inconvenient passages, you can tell a more accurate story. And so I'm going to touch on in my presentation a little bit about Numbers 13:33. I won't have to cover off quite as much because of what Ken has talked about. And he is quite right that we want to be very careful of that passage in Numbers 13:33. And I'll come back to that. And so Nephilim in some of the English translations shows up as giants in the King James Version. And so if you're reading a different translation, you need to sort of know that going in. And that's because in the King James Version, the word giant goes back to the Hebrew word nephil, and I am is the male plural. And it can mean a tyrant, it can mean a bully, it can mean a giant, it can be a tribe of giants, it can mean a potentate. So you have to make sure that you're going to apply Hebrew definitions to the narrative and it's not in conflict elsewhere. But the short narrative that we get, as Ken talked about, is we are told that they are from the sons of God. And I don't know whether or not there's a positional difference on there, but it sounds like Ken might be in agreement with that the sons of God are angels and watchers, which does show up in the Bible in Daniel 4 times. If not, we can go into that a little bit later on the rebuttal. So Nephilim shows up 3 times in the Bible only. Genesis 6:4, Numbers 13:33. That's it. But that's not the end of the story. And we're also told that not only did the sons go to the daughters of men once, but they did again. What we're not told is when does that mean? Is that before the flood? Is that after the flood? Or is that many times before the flood? And is that both? We don't know which. We're not told. And so what we have to go on then is if Nephilim were all killed in the flood, then how do giants show up after the flood? And we're not told how that is, but what we are told is giants show up after the flood. And there's a reason for that, because they're not the Nephilim, they're actually the Rephaim. And so Rephaim, as they first show up in the War of Giants in Genesis 14, Rephaim is used 25 times in the Old Testament. That's Rapha, and the I am male plural, just as seraphim would have the I am male plural for the serpentine angels. And so Rephaim shows up 10 times as giants. It shows up 6 times as giant. It shows up 2 times as Rephaim with an S, which is the silly translation because the I am is the plural. And it shows up as Rephaim 7 times. And so you have that word giant. It goes back to the Hebrew meaning of invigorating as in a giant, as a tribe of giants, and as plural as in Rephaim. And that's number 7497. There's another word that it goes back to, which is 7495 as the root word, which means healer, physician. And in another word, 796, they're all spelled the same way, which means ghost, deceased, shades, and spirits, or the demonic spirits of the Nephilim or the Rephaim after the flood, as people might want to look at that. What's interesting about the healers is that in legend, not in the Bible, like sort of make this sort of says a connection, is that they were thought to be very difficult to kill. So you had to take their head because they had this regenerative sort of capability. And one of the sources for that word healer and the application and the connection to the giants. But you also have to understand it can mean it's used as for a healer of God and physician. So again, it has to fit the narrative. And so, but we do have 25 times where giants are used in the Bible, where it's either translated as giant or Rephaim. And it's important to keep that in mind because the Bible doesn't exaggerate. So if they're talking about giants in the New Testament, they showed up somehow, some way. Either they survived the flood, which is not my favorite position, somehow on the ark, which is not my favorite position. The only way that they could show up after the flood would be a second incursion that would fit best biblically for how that happens. So if you have the sons of God going to the abyss before the flood, then the offspring gods, like Baal, which is son of El in the Canaanite pantheon, or Zeus in the Greek pantheon. And they created in the Canaanite pantheon the Rephaim. Then if they did that in the same way that the Nephilim did in Genesis 6:4, then they would go to the abyss as well. And those are the angels, the impassioned and the most violent angels that are in the abyss. That's recorded in Revelation 9. And it's the same beings that are referenced in Jude 1:6, same beings that are referenced in 2 Peter 2:4, and the same reference in 1 Peter 3. So these are all the same spirits and the beings that are in the flood. And when we get into Genesis 14:5, we get the War of Giants. I won't go into the Mesopotamian ones. That's going to be part of my next book. But you have the Rephaim that are part of the first people that are fought against, or the giants in the Mount Hermon region. And it's important because there's also the Zuzim, the Amalekim, the Horim, and the Ammi, all giants. And I'll come back to that. So in Deuteronomy 2, in verses 10 to 12 and 2 and 20, you get those connections. So you've got like the Emim and the Anakim and the Horim and the Zamzuzim, in this case, not the Zuzim, and the Avim are all classified as giants, and that's the Hebrew word Rapha again. Right? Giants. So if we accept Nephilim as giants, then we have to accept Raphaim as giants, but somehow different, because of part of the embellishment that's going on in Numbers 13:33. So in Deuteronomy 3:11 to 13, King Og of Bashan, of Mount Hermon, and of course Mount Hermon is in the book of Enoch, not that it's in the Bible, but that's where the oath was taken to create the giants. So a nice, interesting sort of biblical connection there that suggests there might be something to that antediluvian story, and perhaps the same place where the oath may have been taken again or restarted with the Baalim who ruled from Mount Hermon. Sort of makes some sense again. Joshua 3:11 calls King Og, and part of his definition is long-necked, as in the Anakim is long-necked giants. He is the last of the giants. And that's also recorded in Joshua 12:4 and 13:12. I'm not saying he's the last of the Rephaim, as some people say. The last of the giant goes back to the word Raphaim. He's a Rapha. And we have the Anakim, who we have a patriarch who's not listed in the Table of Nations. His name is Arba. He's the father of the Anak. He's the father of the Anakim that lived in Kiriath Arba region, that lived in the same region as Hebron, because they're the same name in the Bible, very close to Eshcol, where they grew grapes. And one of the chieftains, Amorite chieftains, as he's described in Genesis 14, that allies with Abraham to fight against the Mesopotamian kings and free Lot. And that's the same name as the Valley of Eshcol, where they get the grapes from in Numbers 13:33. So we do know the location. Further, 1 Samuel 17:4 talks about Goliath, and he is 6 cubits and a span. So we get an indication of length. If it's a common cubit, that's 18 inches. If it's a royal cubit, it's 21 inches. So he can be anywhere from 9 feet 9 to 11 feet 3 inches. Unless you think the Bible exaggerates, which I don't, unless you think the Bible makes mistakes, and I don't think it does. And that sort of matches up with this iron bed that King Og had, that was 9 cubits by 4 cubits. As a king, probably measured on a royal cubit, just as Goliath was from Gath, and probably a king from Gath would have been measured on a royal cubit as well. That would make it 13.5 to 15.9 inches long and 6 feet to 7 feet wide. It had to be of iron, not wood. Why? Because he's so big. So we get a couple size references in the Bible that we can start to shape up. But I think the Rephaim are smaller than the Nephilim before the flood. I think they're a smaller version, because that's not the size that you see people talking about. I don't think they were 400 feet tall. They may have been 20 to 50 feet tall, perhaps, but we don't get a size on that. The only thing that we really get for a size that's not in the Bible comes out of Ugaritic text that talks about the Rapidu, and then balanced and also supported by Sumerian texts where Gilgamesh from the city of Uruk, a king, was 11 cubits and 4 cubits wide. So he was a king, would have been royal. He would have been 19 feet and just over, and would have been 7 feet wide. These are monsters. These are huge. Not the same size as, let's say, Og being at least 12 feet tall, maybe as high as 14 feet tall, and Goliath being 11. That's even 400 years later. And so we also have 4 other sons born to one particular giant. That's talked about in 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. And you have Saph, Ishi-Benob, Lami, who's the brother of Goliath. That makes Goliath the same son. So 5 sons to one giant, and one with 6 fingers and 6 toes. So when we look at those references, we have references to giants in size. We also have more references to giants not known as giants. I won't go through all of the giant names. I have them. If I have to bring them all out and read them, I will. But I'll just say the Anakim, Anak, and Anakites are listed 18 times. You have the Horim listed 2 times, and many other times as Horites. And there could be a difference there because there could be hybrid humans that they intermarried with that would make them a different and smaller race. And that they were called the Shazu by the Egyptians, the Shamau or the Amau, and also the ones that were taller than the Israelites, but not the Anakim that's talked about in Numbers 13 that I'm going to get to in a minute. So you have Avim 4 times, Emin 3 times, and as I said, Rephaim, and there are other names that I won't go into it because I think I've made the point that we have giants mentioned a lot in the Old Testament. So when we look at Numbers 13, 1 through 33, we get 2 different parts of the report that Ken was talking about. We get the evil report. And that's evil for a number of reasons, including the use of Nephilim. First of all, it's evil and a bad report and against what God had promised and instructed, because God said, promised a land that was good, not one that would devour the people. It was a land of good things promised by God, also in Numbers 13 or 11, 31, 29. And God also promised in Numbers 11, this is just before Numbers 13 as well, these 3 passages for protection for all, no matter who the people are. And in Exodus 32, 28, he would send out hornets before them and also have the angel of God there to help protect them. So God had promised to protect them. And these spies are, the scouts are distorting and trying to scare people because they don't want to do this. And this was also a time just shortly after where they're complaining about not having any meat. And now they're offered the land of milk and honey, and they're turning it down. So here's what's going on with the evil report with the Nephilim that is mentioned twice in Numbers 13:33 as giants, the Hebrew word Nephilim. It says that the Anakim are the sons of the Nephilim. Well, that's not true. The Anakim are Rephaim, as are talked about in Deuteronomy 2. But what it underlines is that the Anakim are giants. It also, but a different kind of giant. It underlines also the veracity that the Israelites were aware of what happened before the flood in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, which is the preamble to the flood story and part of the cause, and probably the most significant part of the cause that brought about the apocalypse. It's in the preamble to the flood story, just as it is part of the flood story on all continents all around the world. So when we look at what it actually says in the legitimate part of the details that comes in Numbers 22 through 27 by Caleb and Joshua, if I've got the 2 spies remembered right, they talked about the three kings of Anak and the children of Anak, not the children of giants and translated back to Hebrew as Nephilim. They're the children of the Anakim race from the patriarch Arba, who made his home where they went and got the grapes from in the Hebron region. These people were described in verse 28, people strong and great and live in fortresses. And they saw the children of Anak there. So you have two different levels of height. So the Shazoo or the hybrids would have been, according to the Egyptians, 6 to 9 feet tall, but the Anakim would have been taller still. And that's why Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai are listed separately because they're different. These are the kings of the Hebron area that are dealt with during and then again after the flood, where Caleb finally runs them out. And so they lived in these mighty fortresses, which is all part of this whole greater covenant land of fortresses and Rephaim-led kings with hybrid humans, which is why you have patriarchless humans in Genesis 10. You have sons of Canaan, Heth and Sidon, and then all the other are patriarchless. The 70 nations that are listed all have patriarchs except for those 10. Arba was a patriarch. He's not listed in Genesis 10. One might think Rapha might be one of the first Rephaim from whom they take the name from, because a lot of these tribes are just vernacular names for the Rephaim, right? So Rapha might have been a patriarch, but certainly Arba for that branch is the patriarch, not listed in the table of nations. And then in Deuteronomy 1, we get a confirmation of the details of the legitimate report. 40 years later, before they're going to enter into the land of the giants. In Deuteronomy 2, you get the listing of all of those giants. So everybody is aware that's what they're going to be going up against, which also included the mighty seven, which were mostly Canaanites, right? But hybrids, led by Rephaim kings. I'll say that is a likely outcome of having Rephaim kings that are, in the Hebron area and other areas. And
Gary,
so Deuteronomy, I'll finish up here in just a second.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, I'm just coming to an end.
No worries.
It's a big subject.
I know, you're doing great. Yeah. I just wanted to let you know. Yeah. So go for it.
So in Deuteronomy 1, what's confirmed by Moses is that all the good fruit of the land is there. It's the land of milk and honey. And it's a good land that God is going to give Israel. And in verse 27, people murmured because of what was said in the evil report. And that in verse 28 says it had great walled cities. That's confirmed. It has people greater and taller than the Israelites. That's what it says, greater and taller. And it had the sons of the Anakim. And not Nephilim, Anakim. But not to fear, because God was going to be with them. And so just sort of a brief biblical sort of details on how much giants are actually talked about and how it doesn't contradict itself. You just have to look at other verses and it'll tell you more of the story.
No, that was great. So I think we'll start with Ken. So I'm sure you have lots of, so you can talk and ask Gary. You guys are both gentlemen, so I'm sure we'll be fine here. But so you can start, Ken, with your rebuttal or question, whatever you want to call it.
Fascinating presentation, no question about it. I will have to admit that it was difficult to follow, and it's mostly because you seem to be employing the vague, generic, subjective, and multi-usage English word giant to imply something about subjective height, subjectively unusual height. But that is not the meaning of the word giant in English Bibles. That's not what it means whatsoever. So one problem I had is you're employing an English word, and then also you're throwing in Hebrew words. But then you're going back and forth on those. So it was kind of difficult to know to whom you were referring by any given usage of the word giant. So for instance, you say, yeah, let me just point at just a couple things here. You said, how do giants show up again? So in that case, the word giant is referring to Nephilim. But then you say they're not Nephilim, but then you say they show up again. So it's really
Well,
hard to follow.
No. I thought I was clear. Maybe I wasn't. I could go through certain aspects for you again, and I think probably maybe for the audience, just in case you are correct, is that word Rephaim means giant. Nephilim means giant. Yeah, it's in the Strong's Concordance. I gave you the number 7497. You can look it up.
It's fine. Let me just point this out.
I'm not finished. I am not finished. Please let me answer your question. So when I'm going back, I'm using the King James Version that shows giant and or Rephaim as it's translated into English. Most times in other translations, it'll just say, well, actually, no, it'll have Rephaim and giant as well in some of the other translations as well. It's on the Nephilim as giant, as in Numbers 13:33 and in 6:4, where it only says giant. And in some of the translations, like the King James, and in other ones, it will have Nephilim put in there. But the word Rephaim and giant are used interchangeably in the King James Version Bible and in other translations where it has the giant. And it's the Hebrew word, as you take that back, whether it's giant or Rephaim, that goes back to 7497. All you have to do is look it up.
Go ahead, Ken.
Okay. Let's go with that. You're asserting that, you're claiming that Nephilim and Rephaim are both words that have their roots in a word that refers to giants. So that just begs the question.
That's not what I'm saying. That's what the Strong's Concordance says.
What does giant mean?
Well, giant is understood as being taller.
Okay, understood by whom and when?
Well, it's a common understanding.
Excellent. Yes, indeed. Good. Okay, now, when we're thinking about linguistics, there's a difference between the meaning of a word and the usage of a word. So it's only
my
strictly,
my preference would have been.
I need to just finish my sentence,
go
please.
ahead, Ken. Yeah, let Ken go, and then
it's strictly in modern times that the word giant has been used to imply something about subjectively unusual height. Back in the days that, back when the word giant was used in English Bibles, that is not the meaning of it whatsoever. It has no implication of height, usual or unusual. It's just simply not there. Because the English word giant comes from the Greek word gigantes. And so what the King James and other versions did is that they're picking up on the Septuagint. They're picking up on the LXS usage of gigantes to render, not even translate. It's rendering either Nephilim or Rephaim or Giborim. And the word gigantes means earth-born. It has no implication of height whatsoever.
I was going to say, to save you a little bit of time there, I would prefer if the translators would have used Rapha for singular for whom they were talking about, or Rephaim for the tribe that they were talking about, and then Nephilim as opposed to, just to keep it simple for people. I think that would make more sense. But that would not deter both meanings as being giant. And we get a reference to, as I said in the presentation, of the height of Goliath and the size of the bed of King Og. We get references there. It's one thing to dismiss the idea, and you have the choice to not accept what it says in the Bible. I get that. I'm not here to argue beliefs.
Oh, that is an absolutely uncalled for statement. That's not the least bit helpful. We're sharpening iron with iron. We agreed about that ahead of time. So
I wasn't finished.
That's just not helpful, please. So I think the issue then is, if we're going to talk about Og and Goliath in terms of their unusual height, what makes you think that unusual height was a feature of Nephilim, so that then you go on to correlate unusual height to Nephilim?
We don't know how big Nephilim were.
Exactly. So you can't correlate Og and Goliath to Nephilim based on their height. That falls apart right there.
I didn't. I correlated them to Rephaim.
But see, that was my point, that you said, how do giants show up again post-flood?
You never let me finish. You just jump in.
Go ahead, Gary. Oh.
So we have Nephilim that I've said I don't think showed up after the flood. They're called giants. I have said people thought they were 20 to 40 feet tall, some people even taller. What I said was we don't know how tall that they were. What we do know is that they're part of the flood story, and that they're seemingly part of the cause of the flood story. You can deduce that they were smaller, you can deduce that they were larger, but they were an impact on the flood. And in the wiping out of the flood, you would expect that they would be wiped out. So if you have giants again that show up after the flood, and they do, then you have to recognize that they did. God is Alpha Omega. Now, he didn't stop the angels from creating the giants before the flood. And he may have not stopped ones who weren't taken to the abyss, because there was a lot of fallen angels that rebelled, up to 33 million. If you can use 10,000 times 10,000 as the number of angels, it's at least 33 million. Not all went to the abyss. Not all of them broke the laws of creation. Not all were there. So I'm not done. What I'm saying is if they showed up after the flood and we don't know how, we have to be open to how they show up after the flood, but know that they did. What I also said was my preference was a second incursion because it fits the Bible better.
Go ahead, Ken.
Okay, so I wrote this quotation while you were speaking in your opening statement. How do giants show up again within the context of how do they show up again post-flood? So then my question was, what makes you think Nephilim were unusually tall? And you said you don't know. So you can't ask that question anymore. You can't say how did they show up again.
Well, let Ken finish, and then you can jump in,
what
Gary.
I said.
Go ahead, Ken.
Fortunately, when this video is posted, everybody will be able to get the transcript and also listen to it, because I wrote that as quotations. It seems to me like you are saying there were pre-flood giants and there were post-flood giants, but you can't say there were pre-flood giants because you admit it, you don't know how tall they were.
What we have is the understanding that the Nephilim are giants. You accept that or you do not.
But you said you didn't know how tall they were.
You can say they're not giants. I get that.
You said that. You're the one that said that.
I said I can't prove the height because it's not listed.
Well, there it is.
I'm not going to use the cubits or the L's that are used in First Enoch because it's not in Scripture. We don't have original Hebrew text.
Cubits are in Scripture.
We're not even sure how big an L is, and I think the cubit is a bad translation, because whether or not you're looking at the Giez translation or the Aramaic translation, one says cubit, one says L's, and it says 300 of them. But we don't know how big that is. All I'm saying is they're understood as giants.
Okay, so for one, let's just take stock. You are the one arguing that we don't know how tall Nephilim were, and I agree with you completely. When they're referred to by the English word giants, that English word does not imply anything about height whatsoever.
Well, of course
that's the point.
Well, of course it does.
It does in modern days, but it didn't back when it was used to render gigantes.
Well, when the King James version was translated in the 1600s into English, giant was understood as a giant. You know,
that may be the case,
Jack the giant.
But I'm talking about the Torah written millennia ago. So
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about.
Well, I am. I'm talking about the Bible. I'm not talking about something that didn't exist until the 1600s.
You're not letting me finish again. You always do that. Let me finish. And you don't know what the size of the giants were either, that the Nephilim.
I don't even know what you mean by giants.
I'm not done yet. What you're saying is that because you don't know, you're going to impose your belief on some meaning coming out of Greek as gigantes and gyges, right? Both words are connected to gigantes as it comes out of Greek. That's fine. But the Greeks called their giants heroes and titans of the earth. Atlas was both a titan and a hero, right? And you had titans of the heaven and titans of the earth. And so using your analogy is that they still had giants. And whether or not...
This isn't about Greek mythology, it's about the Torah.
I'm still not finished. Now, what I will do this is describe to you some of these giants. This comes from Josephus. Pharisees, Sadducees lived with the Essenes. And he said this, two things on it. He said, this notion that fallen angels were in some case the sense of the fathers of the old giants, he understood them as giants, was the constant opinion of antiquity. Now, here's how he described the bones. For which reason they removed their camp to Hebron, who we were talking about earlier, Numbers 13:33, Kiriath Arba, and when they had taken it, they slew all the inhabitants. They were there till left the race of giants who had bodies so large and countenance so entirely different than other men that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. The bones of these men are still shown to this very day, unlike to any credible relations to other men. Now, the key point is he's talking about giants and their countenance so entirely different and so large. This is from the time of Jesus. This is the time of the guy writing the history for the Romans, so the Hebrew history isn't lost from the earth. And he is deeply embedded in all three of the major sects of Judaic religion and of the Old
What was he
Testament
talking about?
understanding.
Who was he talking about?
He was talking about the Rephaim.
Okay, exactly. So I'm talking about that we're agreeing we don't know the height of Nephilim, so let's just leave them aside. They're done for. Now we're just talking about Rephaim. That's fair
No,
enough.
they're
Let's
not.
just.
They're not done for.
But you said that post-flood quote unquote giants are not Nephilim.
They're different. They're somehow different because they're called different. We don't know what, but they were different. But what we do know is they were a significant part of destroying and bringing violence and destruction to the antediluvian world. And to do that, they would have needed to take out
No,
over.
Rephaim didn't exist pre-flood.
I wasn't done.
Okay, and then Ken can go. Yeah.
Yeah. What we do know is, and what we can deduce is that they would have been very powerful and great in numbers and had control over government to parade the earth into that sort of direction. It's a similar story that happens after the flood. They have the same traits. They have the same gods. They have the same pantheon of gods.
Ken, go ahead.
Okay, sure. I want to talk about Josephus a little bit, but just as a personal favor to me, how about we drop the vague, generic, and subjective multi-usage word in English, giant? Just drop that word and tell me whether you're referring to Nephilim or Rephaim or someone who's subjectively unusually tall, because then it's so incredibly hard to follow. And then when I'm trying to get some clarity, you keep telling me I'm interrupting you, but I'm just trying to understand to whom you're referring. So now,
when we're talking about one, we're talking about one. When we're talking about the other, we're talking about the other.
Exactly. So just tell me which one we're talking about at any given time, and that'll just make it easier.
Well,
so now Josephus is interesting.
Go ahead, Ken.
But you can't refer to Nephilim as giants because you admit it. You don't know how tall they were. Okay, Josephus.
Well,
now,
we get a reference in Numbers 13:33 comparing the Anakim to the Nephilims as an embellished basis, but they were like grasshoppers as an embellished basis. But that testifies to the veracity that they understood the Nephilim as giants. Otherwise, it was a worthless comment. That it would have actually, if they were smaller than the Anakim, why would you make that reference if you're trying to stop people from going in to fight them?
Well, that's not explained by asking a rhetorical question. It's explained by the fact that they're so intimidated, they want to do anything to get out of that situation. So they make up a "don't go in the woods" type of tall tale. And the Israelites never saw any such thing. It's only the 10 who assert that they saw it. Okay, so let me talk about Josephus for just a second.
Can I answer that last comment?
Just let Ken. Well, you can answer after Ken does
Go
this.
ahead. You know what? Go ahead. That way we don't kind of break the discussion. Go ahead.
If the Nephilim weren't more terrible, they wouldn't use that to scare the people. It would have been helping to make the legitimate scouts case.
The overall point that we seem to sometimes agree on and sometimes disagree on is there's no such thing as post-flood Nephilim. So it's made up stuff, and that's the main point. Now, as for Josephus, what's interesting is you first admit you don't know how tall Nephilim were, but then you call them giants, and then you refer to anybody who's unusually tall as being somehow correlated to Nephilim, such as Goliath. So now this is what's interesting about Goliath.
I didn't say
To me, the issue of cubit versus royal cubit is essentially irrelevant, because when you say that if we're using the standard cubit, he was just shy of 10 feet, that's according to the Masoretic text. However, the earlier Septuagint and the earlier Dead Sea Scrolls and the earlier Josephus have Goliath at being just shy of 7 feet. So that's the more reliable earlier attestation by 3 different sources. So Goliath's height is really almost irrelevant. It's only relevant to Israelites because contextually, at the time, they averaged 5 foot, even 5'3". So to them, someone who's just shy of 6 feet is incredibly tall. But the point is, it's irrelevant. How does it matter how tall he was? It has no relevance to Nephilim. And so what if some of the Rephaim, like Anakim, were quote unquote tall? It's just irrelevant.
Well, if you're going to use the Septuagint, which I don't like the reference because it wasn't even used for the King James Version for the translation, maybe for reference because it was considered very inaccurate. But if you want to use that, and you want to use that to argue against giants, you need to deal with Genesis 10, where it says Nimrod made his reputation fighting giants. That isn't included in
I don't know what
Genesis
that means.
10. Well, that's what it says. He says he made his reputation
No, it
as a
doesn't, 'cause
mighty
it's written in
hunter. Let me
Greek.
finish. He made his reputation as a mighty hunter and a mighty warrior before God against the giants. So if you're going to say that giants aren't legitimate and you're going to use the Septuagint, you have to use all of it. Now, I didn't say Goliath was Nephilim. I said he was Rephaim. And I don't know, I'm just going to look up the word giant here to see what you're talking about in the English language. Because translators are using words that are understood in the English language.
Contemporaneously.
Translate another word, right?
Contemporaneously. You know, I'm not sure if we should
Okay.
do live.
Giant,
Okay.
huge, first word, huge. Mythological being of more or less human form, a person of abnormally great stature, anything much above the usual size of its kind, a person of extraordinary powers.
What are you reading?
Webster's.
Okay, fair enough.
English. It's the English
Fair
language.
I need you to understand that you telling me the usage of the English word giant today is utterly irrelevant to the meaning of the word that it's rendering in ancient Hebrew. I
So
already said this.
So
I
you're
already
saying
pointed out
so
that
you're
we're
saying
discussing
all
an
English
ancient.
translators.
One
Let me
second.
finish. So you're saying all English translators have translated the sort of connotation, the understanding incorrectly.
No, I'm saying you are reading the connotation into it. See,
Well,
what
I
they
read the
did.
definition.
What they did is they picked up those English translators picked up on the Greek usage of gigantes. You are then saying, hey, when they say that, this is what they mean.
Giant was a word being used before the King James Version Bible. They weren't trying to draft a Greek word into the language of that time. They understood giant as they understood giants in England. They understood giants as Gog, Magog, and Albion. They understood the giants as the Tuatha De Danann in Ireland and England. Well, because they were English.
It doesn't matter where they were born. They were translating the Bible, so they're looking at Bible manuscripts. So you're dealing with ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek. You're not dealing with a dictionary that was published a few years ago in English.
But they translated the connotation.
You are
They
reading that kind of... No,
I'm not reading that. I'm reading what they translated.
let me put it this way. They weren't implying that. Rather, you're inferring that. That's the problem.
Well, they used the word giant.
Okay, that's called a word concept fallacy. It
It's in the
means
dictionary.
that I'm flummoxed. It's in a
Well,
modern
you
day
ought to
English.
be. You ought to be. You're making nonsense.
Okay. I'm not sure that's a very helpful statement, but I already pointed out that there's a difference in linguistics between meaning and usage. So the modern usage has no correlation to the ancient meaning. That's just basic etymology in linguistics.
I shouldn't have probably said nonsense, but I am
I appreciate
reacting
that.
to.
I
I'm
appreciate it.
reacting to all the things that you said. Like what I said was irrelevant. Everything I said was confusing. All sorts of things all the way through. But I have to tell you,
well,
you can't.
That's an exaggeration, but that's okay.
What I'm telling you is that if we have an understanding of something as giant, and when they're doing the translation using, let me finish. If they're doing the translation from the Hebrew Masoretic text is the main one that they use, and they are using some Greek transcripts as reference, they're translating what they feel that the rabbis of the Judaic tradition felt and how it matches up with all of the references and translated it accordingly. That matches perfectly to what the Josephus wrote down as the Pharisees, Sadducees, and lived amongst the Essenes.
Okay, if I may, let me give me just a second to read a quotation. Okay,
Go for it.
Go ahead.
this is from J. Edward Wright, who is the J. Edward Wright Endowed Professor of Judaic Studies and Director of Arizona Center for Judaic Studies in the University of Arizona. Here's what he states. The term traditionally translated as giants in both the Greek Septuagint, gigantes, and now in the English is Nephilim, a term based on the root nephal, meaning fall. It has nothing to do with size. And then he specifies that this goes for both the Hebrew and the Aramaic. The root nephal in Aramaic also means fall and not giants.
Yeah, okay, and it's a really good point there, because when you use the root word for Nephilim, which is Nephal, and you put the I-M on it, it's the Nephilim, it's the fallen ones, just as they are the men of renown of Shem and Shemayim, the heavenly ones. And so you can't totally define the extended word from the root word. You can maybe look at a larger meaning to see what that means, but that doesn't dismiss the definition of the word that derived from the root word Nephal. But it might lead you to conceive that the Nephilim were the sons of God.
Right, and I think that
the Nephilim.
What you just said is a good understanding of the point I was trying to make. There's a difference between meaning and usage. There's a difference between a root and a word. And that's what we're getting at. You can't just read the modern day English word giant, assert that it implies subjectively unusual height, and then read that into text where it doesn't exist, like referring to
But
odd.
again, where you've got a gap on you trying to build your bridge there, is that it was the word Nephil that was translated, not Nephal. And the Strong's Concordance definition from the King James writer, from James Strong, who did it, means giants and a tribe of giants and a bully and a tyrant.
And so that begs the question, what did he understand the word giants to mean? And how do you know that?
Well, how do I know he believed giant meant giant in English?
No,
probably because he
did
the
no. I didn't ask that at all.
Strong's Concordance.
No, that's not what I asked.
What did you ask then?
You're saying that Strong's used the word giant. That begs the question, what did he mean by the word giant?
Well, if he didn't know the meaning of giant, I would presume he looked it up in a dictionary.
And that would lead us back to the fact that you're asking us to rely on modern day definitions of modern day usages of modern day words. What I'm saying is
That's not
he
what I
would
said
have
earlier,
been.
is it? That's not what I said earlier, is it?
No, but
When I
that's what
talked
you
about
did.
the
You actually
translators,
showed us
you
a
just brushed
dictionary.
aside what I said earlier and you put words in my mouth that I didn't say again. What I said earlier was this, is that the translators were translating from Hebrew in the Old Testament into English, and they were referencing, for reference only, some of the Greek manuscripts, but they're totally unreliable, which is why they didn't translate directly, and with the understanding of the rabbinic Judea beliefs as to what the word Nephilim or Nephil in the singular is actually meant. And so I didn't say what you said. All I said is that's how they understood Nephilim to mean, translating it into word, that the word that most fit was the word giant, as we understood giant today, as they understood giant back then.
Okay, so when you say there are problems with the Septuagint, I'm going to totally agree with you. So here's an example. The Septuagint translators, for unknown reasons, rendered, not translated, they rendered the word Nephilim and the word Rephaim and the word Giborim all as gigantes. And
Yes.
it's a terrible idea to render three very different words with very different meanings using only one word, because it caused the kind of confusion we have today where people are reading English Bibles and they're saying giant, 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 and it all means the same thing in every single usage, which is just not the case.
Which is why I don't like to use the Septuagint, because it's unreliable.
But the point is, that's why the word giant ends up in English Bibles. It's because of the Septuagint.
You don't know
And
that. That's not what the translators said.
what did they say?
They said they took the
And who are
word.
the translators, by the way? Because I'm referring to every single English Bible
No, what I can
that
do is I
uses
can
the
say,
term giant.
I can. There
Go
was
ahead.
like over 40 or 60 translators, right?
Of what?
Of the King James Version Bible.
Okay, I'm not just talking about the King James. I'm talking about any English Bible that employs the English word giant. We don't. They're picking it up from the Septuagint because that's the etymology of the word
Well, I
giant.
know. I think
It
they're.
comes from the Greek.
I think they're taking the lead from the King James Version translators in a lot of cases. It has many translations based on that. But there are also some translations that's like the NIV that they're using Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts. And they're using the word Nephilim instead of giant in some cases, but they're also using the word giant.
And when they do, it's incumbent upon us to demand to understand what they mean by that word. Not what we think, not what a dictionary says, removed from the context, but to ask them, what do you personally mean when you personally use that word? That's very important to do.
Do we have to do that with every word they use in their translation?
It certainly wouldn't hurt, but because of the
Doesn't
word
sound
giant
very
is
practical.
multi-usage. Okay, may I ask you, Gary, how tall are you, if you don't mind?
6 feet.
6 what?
6 feet.
I thought you
6 feet.
said
Me too.
6'8" too. I was
Yeah,
gonna
me
say,
too.
wow,
6 feet.
Gary, you're a giant. You're a
No.
giant. 6'8".
Okay.
I have hazel eyes and pale skin, but I'm not a giant.
So I'm
Slightly
6
gray
feet
hair.
even also, and I've been called a giant many, 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 many times throughout my life. So that just kind of is just a common sense example of how subjective it is. So by the word giant, some people mean a couple of inches taller than average. Some mean feet in total, some feet taller than average. Some mean entire body lengths. So that's why it's
So-
important to stop and ask, what
Well,
do
I
you
think-
mean by that?
And I think the Bible is pretty clear on that. So
It is.
Saul was selected as king because he was at least a head taller than everybody
Well,
else.
you don't know that.
That's what the Bible says.
It doesn't say he was selected because he was taller. It says he was selected and points out that he was taller. There's no statement that, oh, he's selected because of his height. That's not there.
They wanted to have a king like the other nations.
Right, because the other nations had kings and they didn't, so they wanted a king.
Can I finish?
Sorry.
They wanted to have a king like other nations, and he was a head taller. Right? Okay, so they didn't call him a giant, though. They did not. But they wanted to have a king like the other ones, not only in a monarchy, but somebody who was a warrior-like, which Saul was a warrior king, just as David was. But they were happy to have somebody that was, a little taller so that he would lead them. But he didn't call him a giant. And yet in that same period, we get 6 cubits and a span for the height of Goliath. I mean, that's an actual height. That's not 4 inches taller. That's not 5 inches. It's not a foot. The average height, he would have been, even on the lower cubit level, almost 4.5 feet taller, 4 feet taller than the other ones, and almost 7 feet.
What other ones?
Using a royal. Of the Israelites, the average height would have been 5 feet to 5 foot 3 inches.
Okay, so we already discussed the issue of Goliath. You're just relying on the later manuscript, and you're opting for a cubit measurement that would kind of embellish the height. But to my issue is, what that he was taller? So what does that have to do with anything? Let's just grant it. He was 4 feet taller than the average Israelite. What does that have to do with anything? How is that even an issue?
Well, because he would have been huge. He was a mighty warrior. He was huge, They sent him out to fight the best warrior against the Israelites, whom they sent David. And they felt he was a champion that could not be defeated because of that height and that strength. I guess if you don't want to call, somebody that is 9 feet 9 inches to the average of 5 to 5 foot 3 a giant, that's your preference. We also know that they were wider, just as Og's bed was. So when you go to Isaiah 25, and we get the translation of the terrible ones, which is talking about Rephaim kings, as Ezekiel 32 is talking about, the ones that are in the cells of the abyss, for being the terrible ones on earth who are slain. When they talk about them being strong, that's the Hebrew word azaz, which is defined in conjunction with azaz, as they link back together, is not only strong, but stout, as in wide. And the general thought is that the average width to height of a Nephilim was 2 to 1 compared to 3 to 1 of human.
You already told us you don't know
Now you correlate that with the width and the iron of Og's bed, and you connect that to if that's part of the description of the giants. By the way, that's part of the root word of Azazel, but he's only in the Bible in terms of the scapegoat. Let me finish. Then you have this monster that is not only taller, but he's built like a WWF wrestler or a lineman. They are powerful, and they are fleet of foot. These were the ultimate warriors.
So we already admitted we don't know how tall Nephilim were. Now let's admit we don't know how tall Og was, because we're never told.
Well, I doubt whether he would have had a bed that was almost 16 feet long if he wasn't over 10 feet.
Why is that? Why is that?
Why is that? It makes no sense.
To whom?
And it had to be iron, because he obviously.
Well, that's subjective. Hold on, that's subjective.
Well, the details are in there in the Bible.
Exactly, and we're not told his height.
Let me finish. The details are there in the Bible to indicate to the reader there's something here of interest. And it's that big because he is the last of the original Rephaim. It's that big because he is a giant. He's that big because, and it's made of iron, because he is that big in weight.
Okay. So
the details tell the story. You can ignore it. That's fine.
I'm not ignoring anything. I'm the one pointing out that the details are missing about his height. But let's talk about that then. So we have to admit we're not told his height. That's just a fact. So let's talk about how we can try to conjecture about his height. Now, if you measured my bed and you subtracted a foot, you'd get a pretty good idea of how tall I am. But then again, you would think I was 5 times wider than I actually am. And the thing is, I'm not an ancient sovereign. You can't take my modern day bed and correlate it to an ancient king who had, who knows, maybe his harem slept with him. I don't know. I don't want to know. But here's a fact. In the ziggurat called Etemenanki, they found a quote unquote bed that matches the ratio of Og's bed. And it turns out these beds were not meant to be slept on. These were ritual objects upon which male and female goddesses allegedly mated. So we have that from archaeology. We understand that this doesn't mean he slept in it. This means that he had some kind of ritual object on which his gods mated.
Well, and Og would be considered a demigod as the offspring of an angel and a human female, which is the definition of a demigod. So he may have used it for ritual purposes. He may have used it for sleeping. And from that area, I mean, that's the area basically where Gilgamesh comes from, or Lugabanda, or any of the Anunnaki. These things, these were giant demigods. They're also called, watchers on Earth. I'll go back to the size in terms of what Josephus said. He said the race of giants who had bodies so large and countenances so entirely different than other men, they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. The bones of these men are still shown to this very day, unlike any credible relations of other men. I don't know how you confuse those things. That's
okay.
an
Well,
historian.
I'll tell you how I confuse them. And let me, before I answer about Josephus, I just want to make a general statement. I'm not in the least bit denying that subjectively unusually tall people have existed. I just want to make sure when we refer to somebody as such, we actually have the data to back us. So now the question to me is,
I thought Goliath's height was data.
yes, in the most reliable 3 earliest attestations, we know he was just shy of 7 feet.
But
okay,
you
now
said
as
the
for
Septuagint
Josephus,
earlier wasn't reliable.
then go with the Dead Sea Scrolls and Josephus. That's fine with me. You still have 2. And now as for Josephus, what bones was he looking at?
What bones was he looking at? He was talking, if my memory recalls.
Indeed, he was talking. Yes, he was talking about Rephaim.
Yeah, he was talking about Rephaim.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was after the flood.
Right.
I was
So
trying
now,
to think about whether it was in the giant wars of the conquest or it was in Genesis 14.
no, yeah,
I'd have to
okay.
double
So
check
yeah, that was just in general. So now we don't actually know what the bones were, and neither did Josephus, because he wasn't an expert anatomist. So he doesn't know if he's looking at pachyderm bones, whale bones, dinosaur bones. He's looking at bones, and we have to wonder, did he really understand anatomy well enough to distinguish between a humanoid bone versus
You're really going to use that
a
as an
bone that's
argument.
similar of various other animals? Because we all have bones that look very
Seriously.
similar because we have the same designer.
Okay. Well, you're welcome to write off Josephus if you like. That's fine. You can do that, but I don't think you ought to do it in the way that you've just done it.
Well,
But also, I want to go back to what you're talking about in terms of what version should we use, the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Masoretic text. It's the Masoretic text that was handed down through the rabbis from the temple, right? This is the one in the lineage where we know there's no errors. I would rely on the one that Jesus read from.
So what I would say is, I was just merely pointing out we have 3 earlier attestations about his height. Now let's go with the latter one. I don't care. Let's go with let's go with the Masoretic and take that height. My question still remains: what does it matter that he was unusually tall? What does that mean to any of this?
He was a giant. He was Rapha.
Okay, he was a giant. He was Rapha. Okay, so
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
Okay,
Well, I'm not sure what point you're trying to make. You're trying to redefine English words. You're
it's
trying
fine.
to
It's just
write off
it's just a brute fact.
translations. You're trying to write off historians. I get that. You can do that. But
No, you don't, because that's not what I'm doing. I'm actually being a contrarian.
well, so am I. I'm just looking at things that match up from reliable sources that tell the same story.
And what is that story?
It's the story is you have 2 different kinds of giants. One before the flood, one after the flood. Giants are related to the flood story and what happened before. The giants resurface after the flood start the same
What do you mean
kinds.
resurface?
I'm not done. Start the same kind of organizational structure and evils as what was done before the flood, very shortly after the flood. We get giants showing up in Genesis 14, just 300 and some odd years after the flood, and they're described as the aboriginals of the land before the Canaanites get there. So right from the beginning of the flood, and they do the same religions, they do the same evils and the same enslavement of humankind as it was done before the flood. That's the point.
Of course, that's not biblical, but that's fine. So unusually people
Well, that's
unusually
not
taught people
accurate. You
existed
just throw these
post
bombs
flood.
all
What
the
is that?
time.
I'm sorry?
You just throw these bombs all the time. It's quite insulting. I'm trying not to react, but you throw a bomb either at somebody's integrity or my integrity.
Oh
every
my
time
goodness,
you
I've
lead
never done
off.
that one single time. Oh no,
You
no,
just
no,
did it.
no. What, sir, I pointed out that the end of your statement is not a biblical statement. That's just a simple verifiable fact.
What did I say wasn't biblical?
You talked about their religion and government structures. I'm just saying that doesn't exist in the Bible pre-flood. It's just a simple statement.
It's the same gods. It's the same pantheon.
I mean,
It's the same religion.
you don't know the pantheon or gods of the pre-flood people
Yeah, you do.
biblically.
Yeah, you do. You have. I'll give you which pantheon around the world would you like? Okay, well let's go with Canaan.
Oh, okay.
El is the parent god.
Okay, hold on, just
before the
a
flood.
sec.
Baal is the head god after the flood. Baal is the son of El. It's the same religion. It's the same pantheon. They just moved up because the parent gods are gone. For whatever reasons you think they're gone, they're gone. And if you read into the Ugaritic texts, you know the religion and the fertility rituals and the mystical religions that they're praying to Baal and all of the fertility goddesses, and they want to have more Rapiu, which is thought to be a Semitic word for Raphaim, to be created. They wanted more demigods. For some reason, they're having trouble reproducing.
Well, because they all died.
Or killed. Yeah.
So I guess part of the problem here is maybe you weren't made aware, but I made it clear to
See, that's
Jack.
another bomb. That's another bomb. He just said, you weren't made aware. Like, why do you have to do that?
Let me finish my sentence then. You weren't made aware that beforehand I told Jack to make sure that we were going to have a debate about the biblical material, because if we went beyond, it would get so incredibly complicated that it would be difficult to debate. And I'm just saying, it appears that you weren't made aware of that by Jack. Maybe we'll have to slap him in the back of the head or something.
Well, but the thing is that you were introducing all these non-biblical stuff. Including
I don't
Gigantes.
recall doing that. What's that?
Including Gigantes. You were talking about the Septuagint. I mean,
That's
I
Bible.
didn't start talking
Septuagint
about.
is biblical. It's a translation of the Bible from the Hebrew into the Greek.
And as you said, it was an unreliable.
Why don't we here?
And I
I
agree
think
with
this is
that.
being. Why don't we do closing statements? I think this would be. I don't. I think 5 more. 5 minutes of each of you guys closing out your point. I mean, and it was really good. You guys are both so well knowledge in both. I don't. You'll never change each other, but I think both of you guys are. I wouldn't want to debate either one of you. So, Gary,
Well,
do you want to start us off with you? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I love doing debates, but throwing these bombs, this is what I didn't want to have for a debate. But it's just never ending. So what I'm going to do is, for the summary, is I think I've made the case of how often giants are talked about in the Bible, both before and after the flood. I've read a definition of giant. I've given you the Strong's translations. I've given you the heights. I've given you the examples. To say that giants don't exist, or that some of them don't exist, when they're all talked about in sort of the same sort of frame of reference, including post-Diluvian Israelites in number 1333, using a reference to try and scare people, to testify to the veracity of people that they saw as Nephilim, that they were like grasshoppers designed to scare, embellished as part of the evil report when they're talking about the Anakim who are giants. They are using that because they know it's a common point that will track with the Israelites for fear, because they understand who the giants were before the flood. It's the only reason to use it. And that giants are used over 25 times, as I've talked about, rooting back to the word Rapha and Raphaim after the flood. I've talked about all of these other tribes, and there are more, but the ones that are listed in the Bible that are tracked back to the Raphaim as part of that race of giants after the flood, I think makes a pretty darn good case that the Bible isn't inaccurate. The Bible is perfectly consistent. And to call into its question that it's accurate, I can see calling into question of some of the words on some of the translations. I don't disagree with that to a certain degree, but I don't reinvent words to fit in. What I don't do is try and overlay what isn't in the definitions and what isn't in the comparative verses that support and isn't in contradiction with what else is said in the Bible, because I don't believe the Bible contradicts itself. And so when people have a reference, when they're going to go into the land that's occupied by giants, and the people trying to stop them from going in make a reference to the giants before the flood, I don't know how you make a better case that Nephilim weren't giants before the flood, and certainly the Rephaim after the flood were giants. And the definition in Strong's is giant.
Gary, and let's just do your, like, how can people support you and all that stuff, and then we'll go to Ken and all where they can find you, all those things.
Yes, if you want to get a hold of me, the best way to get a hold of me is through my website, Genesis6conspiracy.com, the number 6conspiracy.com. And on the website is a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters. And so you'll get a good feel for whether or not it's a book for you or not. If you want a signed copy, you can get a book off of the website. If you want to link over to the Kindle version, you got an icon to link over there, or over to barnesandnoble.com or over to amazon.com. If you want to support your local bookstore, you can order it in if they don't have it on the shelf through Bookmasters, who it's distributed through. So lots of ways to get a hold of the book. I have a lot of documents on this. So if you want some information on who the Rephaim were or the Nephilim were, what the meanings of some of the names are to the giant nations, or you want to know who the sons of God are or why they're not Sethites, I got documents on all of that. If you want to get a hold of me and much more, just ask for it by topic.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gary. Ken, your closing statement. And then yes.
Thank you, Gary. And I just wanted to say, if anytime you perceive that I was being rude purposely, I that wasn't purposeful. If I did it, it was accidental. So I do appreciate your engaging. Okay, appreciate it. Now, I believe one thing we saw tonight is what I've come to term keyword-based theology, where you look up a keyword, you read every text in which it appears, and then you just string those texts together regardless of context. So you have data points in those verses, and then you just draw a line straight through them regardless of what context those verses are in. Then we saw an employment of the term giants based on the strictly modern definition of what it means, not what the Torah was meaning from 3.5 millennia ago. And we saw a definition of giants imposed upon us by a modern day grammatical English dictionary, not the context of the Torah that, again, is in a whole different language from a whole different culture from millennia ago. So let's quickly review if we're going to say that we were talking about giants, and well, that's the topic of the debate. Nephilim, it was admitted we don't know how tall they were, so you can't refer to them as giants. Rephaim, that was really like a broad reference to a bunch of people group. For example, Anakim are a Rephaim subgroup, so it's kind of like tribe and clan, right? We know that some of the Rephaim were described as quote-unquote tall, like the Anakim. Now that's subjective, as we agreed, to the average Israelite male who was 5 foot 5'3". So being taller than 5 foot 5'3", not really impressive. Og, it was admitted that we don't know his height, but we have to kind of conjecture to try to figure out that maybe we can guess how tall he was. And the issue of Goliath was that we have 3 early attestations about his height. We have a later one that Gary prefers, and I don't have a problem going with the latter one. I mean, it's fine with me. I just still not sure what that has to do with anything. So Nephilim, we don't know their height. Odd, we don't know his height. Rephaim in general, we're not really told, but we know some of them were subjectively tall. And then the issue of Goliath. So when it comes down to it, we virtually have nothing to discuss in terms of giants in the Bible, primarily because you must understand when you're reading the English word giant in the Bible, you're really either reading the term Nephilim in Genesis 6:4 and Numbers 13:33, or you're reading the word Rephaim in 98% of every other single case. And in no case does giant or Rephaim or Nephilim imply anything about unusual height. That's just being imposed upon the text based on modern day usages of that word. Oh, that's where we stand. Now,
And where
to get in
oh,
touch with
I'm
me,
sorry.
yes,
Yeah, sorry. I was
appreciate
just going to say, where can
Yeah, I
they
forgot
get
about that.
all those things?
So my website is truefreethinker.com. And I'll just quickly point out some of my books on the Nephilim are the scholarly academics and the scholarly academic Nephilim and giants. What does the Bible say about giants and Nephilim? The pastoral Nephilim and giants, the apocryphal Nephilim and giants, Nephilim and giants in Bible commentaries, the Bible encyclopedias and dictionaries on Nephilim and giants, and also a book about top researchers, what they have to say about Nephilim and giants. So I've written books about what the Bible says, what apocryphal and pseudepigraphical book says, what scholars have to say, what pop researchers have to say, what Bible commentaries have to say, and dictionaries and encyclopedias have to say. And then one last one is Nephilim giants, believe it or not.
Awesome. Well,
And it's
guys,
found at truefreethinker.com.
I posted your links on the video, but I'll
Appreciate
post
that.
them again
Appreciate it.
on the, when I post the episode. So guys, thanks for doing this. I know I'm a horrible debater, so I thought you guys did great, and I really appreciated it.
Thank you both so very much. It's
All right,
been
guys.
challenging, but overall very stimulating, I must say.
Oh, it was great, guys. So thank you. I'll see you, Gary. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, yeah, I'm fine. We're good.
All right. All right. Thank you so much, guys. All right. Have a good night.
Okay, God bless.
See ya.
Bye-bye. Heyo.
Hey, dude, wait, let me.